Okay, so friends, it's fabulous to welcome all of you here and to welcome Jaime Briseno. I'll mostly let Jaime introduce himself because I think part of what we like hearing from folks is kind of the journey that got them into this space. But I'll say Jaime's been at Georgetown longer than I've been at Georgetown, 29 years, maybe, if I'm right here.
27.
27 years. And does has regions. Georgetown divides things up, and so he recruits very specifically from different regions, but he also leads our admissions office review process for students who are low income first gen students. And so I get to read files with Jaime every year. And so I think he brings kind of really rich perspective on what it looks like to be at the recipient end of these files, these admissions application files. So Jaime, I'm going to step back and let you do your spiel. And
Sure.
folks, we run these informally, so feel free to
Yeah.
drop things in the chat and stuff.
So thank you for inviting me again, Heidi, and nice to virtually meet everyone. I may have met you before in the previous iteration of this last year. I don't know. I don't remember. It's been a crazy year. But yes, I've been at Georgetown. I started in 1992. I've been mostly at Georgetown, starting my 29th year in admissions. I spent a couple of years at the Dartmouth College admissions office. But the most important thing about my introduction is, as I tell students, I'm a former first-generation low-income student from San Antonio, Texas. Went to a public school and always give praise to both my counselor and teachers because they were instrumental in my journey, as well as my mom. And so it takes a village. I handle the states of New Mexico and Texas, which are very far from here. It's a different type of presentation that I do. When I just got back, 2 weeks in Texas, where it's COVID is another different thing. And I happy to break down what we do in the office. I read for all sorts of schools. The committee I chair, as Heidi says, looks specifically at first generation low income students from public schools, urban or rural. But given my tenure, I read international, I read domestic. So my hands are in every pie pretty much. and more importantly, I just got back from travel, and I told my boss, Charlie Deacon, the Dean of Admissions, been at Georgetown for 50 years plus. I always think he needs to be in a high school, walk into a high school physically, because I think it is so critical to understanding the applicant, the letters, and especially in the last 18 months, I can't imagine how you guys are doing it. So I do have a lot of thoughts about the letters because it's been a crazy 18 months, and the teaching and all of that is going to look different. And the letters and the role they play will look different, slightly different or greatly different. I'll leave it at that.
Jaime, would a good starting point be just to describe what happens when
Sure.
everybody submits the paperwork? Because I feel like sometimes that's the black box for folks,
Sure.
even
So,
what the journey looks like.
What happens here is similar to other institutions. The big difference is that other places might have a hard deadline. If they say November 1 or January the 1st or whatever it is, they mean it. We tend to be more flexible and more forgiving. We give grace to both the students and the counselors and teachers. Because we just allow things to become complete, especially for first generation under-resourced students. And then we chase people down. So as soon as a file becomes complete from the time the student starts the application to when all items get uploaded, generally they are distributed to the officers according to region. And we are given, I'm going to use early action because that's around the corner. We're given about 2.5 weeks, 3 at the most, to read everything assigned to us and to chair committees. And so this is one of the reasons, by the way, that we don't encourage supplemental letters or extra materials, because there's already enough to read. And so as those files become complete and I start to read them, I then make notations and suggestions to committees about an action that should be taken. When a file then proceeds to an admissions committee that I may or may not be part of, it is then typically 4 people in that committee, which is a professor, a dean, a student, and another admissions officer. Our process is very old school, is how I describe it. We don't present files as it is done at most institutions. So in that way, letters in particular play a heavy role because we are not there to break things down to say, this is what it looks like to be in Vegas, Nevada. That is the role of the other officer who sends the file to committee. So in many ways, it is, if I send a file to a committee where I'm not going to be a part of, I provide context around what that school or what that situation that the student is coming from. Shorthand for us is, what is the road traveled to get from point A to point B? And also it is always within the context of what resources did the student have at home or at school, or what resources didn't they have to achieve at that level, so that we can compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, which is why we always say we don't admit high schools, we're admitting students. And we're looking for promise for success at a highly competitive place with kids from all over. That's in a nutshell how we break it down.
So, I mean, I know this is a personal decision, but when you're reading a file, what order do you read things in? Kind of how do you,
Sure.
how does the student become 3D for you?
So when a file is available to us, two things happen. Sometimes we use two screens, right? The first thing all of you should know is that no one item makes or break a candidate. If there is one item, it would typically be the transcript, because that's at the heart of the review, right? And so, and I say that because a glowing letter of recommendation is not going to make up for 9th, 10th, and 11th and fall of senior year grades that have been not so great, or that are just starting to get great, because students are competing with, typically students have been very strong from 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. So it's funny because when I make I have a lot of biases, like everyone does, right? And I'm a straight shooter. It's my reputation. So when I was talking to kids in Texas last week or New Mexico, I say, if you're sitting in this room in person, I'm assuming that you may be looking at similar institutions, whether it's Pomona, Tufts, Georgetown, Columbia, Chicago, whatever. And typically you have been very strong, not just junior year. We're looking for students who have consistently been challenged and have taken challenging loads and have done as well as they can, right? So we begin with typically, I get to the what we call the personal side of the application first. The student's story, their activities, how they spend their free time, their interests, their passions, their essays. And this plays a key role, the parental biographical data. And by that, I mean the students has to provide us the names of their parents or guardians, where the parents were born, if there's any other languages spoken at home, and the level of education of the parents. And that immediately gives us a context of the environment the student is coming from at home. I already know the name of the high school, and on another screen, I have the high school name, the city, the state, obviously, the grade, rank, senior class size, and testing, because we're that one school that requires testing. Whole other topic. So even before I open a file, if I'm looking at the school in Austin, for example, at a magnet public school that I know is the strongest arts and science school, I already have a sense of how rigorous it is to be there, right? But what I don't know is apparently coming, college educated, bachelor's, master's, or higher, or high school. And that kind of gives me, before I start reading, a sense of more or less what to expect. But we have to read the file and read the story, right? So we get the student's sense of it to get to the heart of the performance. One thing I tell students and counselors and teachers is, like, I don't know what the student is like in the classroom. I can see the grades, I can see what a high school transcript looks like in Texas or New Mexico, but I don't know what makes that student, if they're performing at level, what it took to get there. I made a comment earlier about how it's going to be different, to me at least, this year. And one thing we noticed, Heidi, which is very interesting for all of you, is we did notice a bit of grade inflation last year at the mid-year, from fall to spring, quite a bit. I mentioned this to the high schools when I visited, and many of them said, you're going to see grades drop because some teachers have put the brakes on that. They've been back in person. But we did see quite a bit of grade inflation. And in some cases, grades went from 100-point scale or A to F to just pass fail. When any of that happens, then it's the narrative of the counselor and the teacher that illuminate for us what is going on in special challenges or circumstances. So this is why I say in this year of COVID, that sort of descriptors that you're using are critical.
So Jaime, I think you and I often agree when we read files together, but we don't always fully agree. What do you look for from a student essay? What do you hope the students can bring to life for you in their essays versus what do you kind of count on the adult voice, right?
So it's different, right? So I think that it's important to know that, I did this sort of workshop with colleagues. I'm doing a third version of this, colleagues from Rice and Stanford for particular parts of Texas, because we're all from Texas and similar institutions. And for the student's essay, a lot of it depends on the prompt or the prompts that the college is giving the candidate, right? So the first piece of advice is we say, follow the prompts. Second, some students use the approach of, we often say, we want to hear your authentic voice. What makes you you? And there is, if it's a very open-ended prompt, they often talk about something about their life, an anecdote, a parent or a friend, usually a parent, a family member that really had a huge impact on them. Occasionally it will be somebody else. These make great stories, right? The only sort of, I would say, detriment, or the only sort of drawback to that is that, on the other hand, I'm trying to picture that student at Georgetown or at a similar selective school. So while it's great to know what kind of made them, some situation at home, it can be a lost opportunity because the entire time I'm thinking about the fit, because Georgetown is a particular kind of place. And that's what I mean by, I don't care if they're sending that essay to Pomona, to Carleton College, to, again, peer sort of institutions, right? And this is especially true for a candidate coming from a first-gen low-income background. I just did some mock interviews this afternoon with Chicago scholars, all first-gen kids in Chicago, and I gave them that sort of piece of advice. And again, because I come from sort of that same path. And so Heidi knows this, I'm pretty harsh, I'm very hopeful, but none of us want to admit a student that we have concerns about their ability to, I say to them, you have to get your academic sea legs really steady. And I actually do say this to them, like, what's making you leave Texas, your family, your friends, your support network, all these kind of things. Think about that as you're applying to college and as you're drafting essays, because an officer wants to kind of picture you there. The challenge for all of you, I think, and for the students, is that you can't possibly write a letter for each college. You're writing teachers' letters for, it could go to UMass Amherst, it could go to University of Missouri. And so in the old days, those of you who might remember, with paper, we used to get more personalized letters. And I think, to me, that's useful. So what I'm trying to figure out is you as a recommender, do you see the student succeed, but at what kind of place? They're going to succeed in college, but I don't know. So it's useful when you use points of comparison, right? Context. This student reminds me of a kid I had 3 years ago who's now in junior year at Hopkins or whatever. Because then I can kind of get how you're making comparison or how you're doling out praise. And typically, or when you say, you know, I've been teaching for 27 years, for 15 years, for 3 years, I think it's always helpful to write a sentence or two at least of your own background, you know, so that we can place that in context. I'm pausing so that folks can either ask questions or Heidi can say, what do you mean by that?
So, I mean, I know I'm just going to bring up one quick thing that I know we talk about a lot in our committee is that we hear a lot, particularly from students, kind of about their life narratives, but we don't hear much about them as a student.
Correct.
Right? And we're an educational institution, so we want to know who you are as a learner. So I think we often turn to the teacher letters in particular, right, to kind of bring that to life and put it into the context of like the whole student, right, that you know that entire student. What's really effective ways when you hear teachers or ineffective ways when you hear teachers kind of talk about their students as learners?
You know, I'll tackle the easy first, the part first, the ineffective. I hate saying effective because I know you're pressed for time and you're writing dozens and dozens of letters and you want to support the students. And we're not looking for flaws. We're not looking for you to use that letter to get back at it, whatever it might be. I think that one thing to know about when you're writing the letter is colleges already have a list of activities. Colleges already have a good amount of information, a high school profile, etc. Right? So to the extent that you can avoid repeating what to us would be obvious things, like their rank, listing their activities, and very generic praise. The student is so special, well liked by everyone. You know, I've heard about the student, but then we don't know why, right? And so to the extent that you can provide at least one or two anecdotes that in your mind stand out about this particular student in that academic area, in relation to whether they want to study. You know, today I interviewed a student who wants to do nursing. And immediately came to mind because Heidi and I are in that committee. And true to form, she couldn't really tell me why nurse. She said what a lot of kids say in that essay. A family situation, they went to the hospital, the nurses are really nice, it made an impact on her. Not a bad thing, but it doesn't tell me, she hadn't, you know, I asked her, have you spoken to any nurses? Have you done this? And she just likes nurses and she wants to be a nurse. That's not enough, right? It's, you know, it could be possibly, but if she hasn't shared it, I would encourage you, if someone's asking you to write a letter for them, they probably give some of you, you do a survey or little questions that they answer. So to the extent that they tell you what they want to study or not, I think can help you craft that letter. So if you say the student is, I know talks a lot about, you know, computer science or whatever the case might be, theater, and I can see them blossoming in that area, or I can see them working towards that goal. But if you don't know the student that well, you're going to have to fall back on what you remember about them. And especially last year, if they were a little screen, right? You didn't get to know them. That's going to, I think, going to be the particular challenge. So before I forget, I think that you need to place that in your letter somewhere, whether you were hybrid all year or part of the year, because, you know, again, Heidi and I are going to be sitting here thinking like, this was a hard year. And she can tell you better than I can. But we've seen some kids arrive at Georgetown this fall, and I'm hoping that they're doing well, you know, but they may not have been socialized with other students. So this is why, again, all these little things at selective schools, at schools that look at these letters really carefully, and want the students to succeed. We're imagining them in that classroom, in that lab, in getting their first, wow, I got a C or D or worse.
I mean, I'm just going to double down on what you said, because I think that who your student is as a social learner is really important. We're anticipating that they're going to be in classes where there's discussions, or they're going to have lab partners, or they're going to be in the dorm and everybody's going to be there studying for things. And I'll actually say this year, it's like an apocalypse on the Georgetown campus for students knowing how to be social learners. They really fell out of the habit in the last year. And they are so excited by the ability, the opportunity, and so clueless about how to be a social learner. And I've actually had kids come to me and say, Professor E, I don't know how to do this whole learning with other people thing anymore. Like, I'm used to my bedroom. They don't want to go back to the bedroom, but they fell out of the habit. So I think, to us, we've always taken that for granted. We get kids who know how to learn in social settings, but knowing about your students, not just as isolated learners, but as social learners, I think is really important to us. Jaime, you mentioned the high school portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
Are those high school portfolios, should teachers be looking at those to see what is and isn't provided in it? Is that the sort of thing that?
I mean, I'm very careful with the demands or expectations I place on teachers, because trust me, I know how busy you are. In an ideal setting, the high school file will have a high school profile that can sometimes be out of date by 1 or 2 years. Usually a private school does a really good job of the freshest up profile. And it's just simple. It's good for us to see, the sequence, for example. A really good high school profile will tell me the sequence in math, science, English. That way we can compare, we can see the menu students had available to them. And then any special programs, whether it's dual enrollment, whether it's AP courses are capped at 3 or by permission, or it's anyone, again, I did a presentation at a low-income public school in Houston on Friday. Great set of kids. 2 of them came up to me. I thought of you, Heidi, because again, we've had these live situations, right? Kid wants to do science. It's a math and science magnet. And I said, oh, great. How are you doing? It's like, oh, I'm top 5%. Very humble kid. Top 5% out of 500. Competitive, lower testing. Didn't surprise me. Said, have you taken AP courses? He says, yes. How did you do? It's like, oh, I did well in the courses. And I said, did you take the exam? And he kind of looked at me sheepishly and says, well, and said, well, does that mean a 3 or lower? It's like more like 1 and 2. And I've heard that before, where students at schools are getting 90s, 95, high 90s, and they take the AP exam and they tank to 1 or 2. And students have told me sometimes, yeah, it was pretty easy in the classroom. This is even before COVID. So again, I'm going to give students grace in the AP and last year, but I think it's going to be tough this year to make these decisions, to say, how comfortable are we knowing the score, because we don't require an AP score. But again, knowing what the school requires and what it expects in the level of again, how they screen more or less for APs or honors can be very informative to us. The last thing I'll say, and I say this to the counselors as well, the more that is on the profile itself that's unusual and up to date, the less you have to explain. Because then you can just focus again on the student, him or herself, in that area that you teach, that you've had them in the classroom.
I'll just amplify what Jaime said. We get a whole bunch of kids who schools have been, I think what we might call is over accelerating. So kids reporting that they took their AP bio class in 10th grade. So that's not an AP bio class the way that they think it is an AP bio class. But we know things like that are outside of your control. But that's kind of like helpful context and stuff as well, because otherwise, we'll look at the AP score that comes in
Mhm.
and it doesn't match up with the grade. But that wasn't the purpose of that class. The purpose of that class in the high school wasn't to get a 5 on the AP, right? There's a whole different game being played. And so that can be really helpful.
Mhm.
I'm gonna remove the pin here, Jaime, so that we're all the same size on my screen, and say, let's hear from folks on the screen about questions you have, maybe very specific questions because you're in the midst of writing letters. But let me just invite folks to unmute and ask away.
I have a question. So you mentioned earlier about how it's really helpful to sort of frame the student like on your campus or on the school's campus. How do we do that when Common App, right, like sends the same letter to all the schools? I guess, do you mean more like I could see a student at a school like this place? Or I don't know if you can elaborate on that, since Common App sends the same exact letter to all schools.
Sure. Again, I think that this is where it comes down to how well you know the student and how much the student has shared with you about their what they hope to achieve or what types of schools they're looking at. The first thing I asked the kids today I interviewed is I said to them, tell me the 3 or 4 must-haves a college, your ideal college should have, because I want to get in my head when they're thinking college, are there, big cities around or small schools around or whatever it might be, right? Some kids may not know, right? Many don't know, but I do think, again, I have a lot of biases here because I was one of these kids, and I'm very intentional. And I said to them at one point, again, I went to UPenn undergrad from a low underserving public high school. And I needed to know how to hustle. I knew that. I needed to know how to hustle. And so I think that to the extent that your student is asking you to write a letter for them, if you can get at least some minimum information out of them about a type of place, because the other component is not just the professors, but it's, again, I remember to this day, 37 years after, whatever, how intimidating it is to hear your peers in the classroom rattle off information and you're like, whoa, what are they talking about? And I think it's those sort of things that I know are going to happen. And when you know they're going to happen, I'm thinking, has anyone spoken to them about this? Not to discourage them, but to teach them how to approach, because it took me, for example, a long time to get comfortable talking to our professor, or let alone a dean. You just don't do that. That's a thing you don't learn at many high schools. I think that's what kind of Heidi was talking about a little bit about the social learning and the sort of how do you react to this sort of environment that's going to be new. So again, Caitlin, so I think that when you have a letter that you're writing for Common App, you can't make up stuff, right? You can't say, I think this kid is looking all over, but then I would just say, I can see them blossoming, or I can see them to the extent that you can actually visualize them at a type of place. I think anything you can provide to an admissions officer in terms of context, again, I'm big on numerators and denominators. Some kid asked me last week, what makes yours sound special? And I shot back. I said, well, I don't know what you consider special. Like I need to know more. And so what makes something special? What makes something whatever?
Caitlin, I think, maybe find out, I guess I would also say, I think when we look for things, it's teachers, we're a rigorous academic school. And so it doesn't have to be Georgetown, right? But if they're applying to like schools that are known for kind of being academically rigorous, then it's good. You don't have to write about how those kids going to thrive in a Jesuit environment. because that's like a really unique thing to us. But like talking about how they thrive in kind of rigorous academic settings and rise to meet challenges and kind of welcome stuff like that. We'll like
and
it.
also,
Hopkins will like it. New Penn will like it.
if you can provide examples as well, if you know them, of kids, of opportunities that students pursued independently. That's to me another trait that's very important. Again, especially if a student is coming from a school that has limited resources. Because again, what I've seen and what I've seen of my peers who were like me, you just have to look for opportunities, and you're wired a particular way, right? And I think that not everyone gets it immediately, which is fine. Sometimes you have to learn these kind of things. But if you know the student has sought out opportunities beyond your classroom, beyond the high school, again, at least that's telling me that the student is an active learner and is curious and is going to pursue more opportunities that are right in front of them.
So I'm thinking about some students in particular when you were talking about AP scores, who, when you have to write 3 essays in a 2-hour period, they may not be able to do that, but with time and just they have the focus, they have the work, and they do it. They do the work, right, to be strong at that. Would that be something to put into a letter of rec? I mean, if that's going to be just that I know, they're not gonna take a 3-hour test and nail it, especially, because maybe they are an English language learner who needs to get to the writing lab and do those kinds of things, but they will do that because they've done it with me. So I don't know how to approach that, especially with testing not optional. That always makes me a little nervous because they're not test takers, but they're otherwise.
I will say, and Heidi knows this as well. Thankfully with us, we know how to use the test and where it makes sense to use it and where it doesn't. And I'm very open when I do these kind of things in person. I'm like, listen, the thing that testing tracks the most closely is family income and social capital. Period. I can say that because I'm not my boss and he's not here. So, and I think most of us in the office get that, right? But we have to work with this policy. So, my dilemma is always that, I believe it. I can go beyond that, easily beyond the testing. So whatever you think in terms of that student style of learning or ability to really focus, I think it's going to be useful. Again, my bias, and Heidi, I think might have a better sense here, I don't know, or any one of you, because the way I learn is very different, or could be very different than other very successful students, right? And so I only know what I know, and I know what I've seen happen at these kind of places. And so when a student is, I think the dilemma is also for me, a student who's very engaging and very likable, because sometimes blinded me to other abilities in the classroom. I'm easily charmed sometimes, and I think that you could genuinely love a student, but I think that, Heidi, we discussed a kid last year. I think she's at Georgetown, and we did not agree on her. It partly was.
Wait, which way did I fall? I'm like weirdly optimistic. People.
I think that you liked her.
Yeah.
This is, and this is because either the counselor or teacher letter says something about and hinted that the student did not take advice. And I don't like hearing that at all, period. And I kept thinking, this kid is very bright. Her sister was at Yale, low-income kid from LA. And I just don't like hearing that a student is they can have raw talent, but they need to learn well with others, and they need to trust adults to some degree. And I had concerns about that. You know who I'm talking about.
I do. We'll like talk, we'll see in 4 years how it all turns out. I think, Kate, I guess one other thing I would say, and so I see this a ton in teaching in the first year courses. So we have an academic resource center here, and they're in charge of like exam accommodations and things, right? So if you get extra time, I have a student in my class who has dyslexia, so she gets extra time. I've got a student in my class who has diabetes and needs to like test the blood sugar, and they get extra time on exams. But we also have a lot of kids who have language processing issues or anxiety, and they also can get extra time. One of the things that we see among first year students, and this is well documented at Georgetown and in other schools, is that if your family comes from means and also themselves went to college, you're much more likely as a kid to have gotten tested for these things and to arrive at Georgetown with academic accommodations. Testing can be very expensive, actually. Georgetown will eventually pay for this for you, but you've got to like get yourself to the academic resource center and things like that. So one thing that we see with kids who come in and do really badly on tests when they first get to Georgetown, one of the first things I do is we sit down and we spend a lot of time with the academic resource center. We talk about this. A very high percentage of these kids end up with exam accommodations. They end up with academic accommodations. And it never occurred to their family. It wasn't built in enough to the schools. These things take a lot of resources. A lot of schools don't have it. And most of the kids we get here are so smart that in kind of everyday exams in your classes, they're still thriving. They might be the last kid to turn it in. And most of these kids will say, oh yeah, no, I was always the last one to turn it in. But they aced it. And so nobody thinks anything of it. Like, I don't, kid turns their exam in late, like last to me, but they get an A on it. Like, it's great. It's just an A. But they get here and exams become bigger, high pressure, longer kind of events. And the same sort of thing you're describing, Kate, on things like SATs and stuff, like the wheels fall off on in-class exams. So the other thing is that it's worth noting, I think, at times that you really think of this as a discrepancy that's a very specific, isolated discrepancy that appears on exams, and it's not a reflection of the student's kind of broader academic skills. It is utterly and profoundly depressing to me, and we kind of are always militating against the system here, but we have found ourselves needing to just literally eliminate exams from kids' grades for a semester because they were due time and a half. And it's because of family income and kind of savvy about the education system that they didn't arrive with that accommodation. And honestly, the richer kid sitting next to them who also earns it and merits it, but they'll arrive with that accommodation. Right? And that can take a real, not just a dent in a grade, but a real dent out of a kid's self-esteem when they get to a place and that happens. So I, in general, we don't pay much street credit at all to exam scores for the kids that we're talking about here because we know that they don't correlate. But I also wouldn't discount that exam score is actually telling us something important about the kid. And not just, I think we're just like, oh, they're not an exam taker. And some people just aren't exam takers. Like I always did badly on multiple choice exams, but that was like just whatever. But we legitimately have kids who aren't exam takers under normal testing conditions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole, but you keep talking about the test optional versus, that whole conversation now. And I know our school has made different decisions both last year and this year about how to like go with our students regarding all of this stuff. I don't know if you can provide any insight outside of the generic talking points that I've heard.
In terms of the role of testing overall?
Just kind of where, I don't know, like it just seems like this, some schools are like, yep, we're not going to do tests anymore because we didn't do tests and blah, blah, blah. Some schools are like, we're going to bring it back. I'm just curious because our school, go ahead, sorry.
No. That's a legitimate question. And it is the question of the year, right? I think when the policies are put out, I'm used to putting schools in buckets, colleges in buckets, right? And so I asked myself, let's say the Ivies, MIT, Stanford, do they need more applicants? Because what that does is bring more people into the pool, which is not a bad thing if you're going after a particular segment, right? But what happens when you put out a policy like that is that it invites more of everyone, right? And I think that testing has a role in certain situations like the ones I described. So again, I kept using this example. In New Mexico, I know the schools pretty well in Albuquerque and in Santa Fe and Los Alamos. I went to Los Alamos High School, phenomenal place, but I don't know Deming High School or what, some rural school. And I don't know the grading. And because I don't know what happened last year, some sort of data point might be useful. But at a place like, let's say the top quote, I won't say the top, the most well-known private school in New Mexico is Albuquerque Academy. It's a co-ed private school. At a place like that, I'm not going to worry about it because all those kids have the tests. They found a way to take the test, to fly somewhere else. They took test prep. They paid for test prep. They're going to get their tests, right? And so I think it's all over the place. I think that, again, for our situation, for the kids that Heidi and I review specifically, or anyone who has lower access to resources and awareness, it's there, but we didn't decide to ask for it. It's just a university, an admissions office policy. We have to see the test scores. And so I don't pay attention to it that much. I really don't, because I shouldn't. I'm literally repeating what I was saying. It's like, listen, it cannot have been easy to put on a mask for 3.5 hours and take that test. In the best of circumstances, it's anxiety inducing. Now layer on top of that, finding a test center, places are being closed left and right, whatever. It's less than ideal. And to expect the kid to do their best on that Saturday morning, I don't believe in it, right? But that's our policy. So I have to work with it. And so, but then I know, thankfully for me, I've been doing this a long time. And so I know when to pay very little to no attention to it in others. I'm like, I don't know, this is telling us something. So in the end, in the file, we're looking for a consistent narrative. Is what we're seeing here. Everyone is saying the same thing. The teachers, the counselor, and the student has been consistently seeking out opportunities and challenging him or herself. That's honestly, to me, the trajectory I'm looking for, because it takes that level of focus and discipline. Again, I think to succeed at the uber selective schools where everyone is used to accomplishing well. I think that you can be more forgiving at other places. My niece went to UTSA and she has got a great job in Austin, and she was going to make it, but she wasn't in this space surrounded by everyone who's achieved well. And that's what I never forget, that I think that you have to be intentional about the kind of places you're looking at to look in. And then a layer on top of that, the whole code switching. If I know they've only been at a school with Black and brown kids, have they thought about what that's going to feel like? All these kind of things. So that's what I'm hoping they have a conversation with you as a teacher or a counselor or someone to talk about that other component that can impact their success, and can mitigate the self-doubt that may or may not happen, but can. Again, I tell the kids I'm atypical. That didn't bother me. I'm like, whatever. I don't really care. get me out of Texas. I want to go back east. But my theory, Heidi, I think I may have shared it with you. So I learned how to code switch really early because I'm gay. So I came out in college, but when you're gay or lesbian or on some spectrum, you learn to code switch very quickly, you know. And so that's just my theory, because I'm like, yeah, those kids, usually I find them succeed a lot, not better, but they're more experienced with it. We've been othered, so we're accustomed to being in this other bucket.
Is there, Jaime, one of the things I think, unless Julie, do you want to unmute? Do you have a question?
No, I was just explaining where I can my camera back on.
Okay. I think, Jaime, one of the things also that we hope for teachers to do is not just in the letters, but to give this kind of guidance to the students. And I know one of the things we talked about last year was even just helping students think about the difference between kind of applying to a college versus to a university, right? So not just kind of the tier, but right, you know, are you a kid that's going to thrive in a smaller setting? Are you a kid that's going to thrive in very, you know, big classes? I don't think anybody really thrives in big classes, but like, are the rest of the benefits about a big university going to outweigh that for you, right? Or are you the person who wants to be known and wants to be able to have a voice in all the settings and wants to be, you know, the big fish in the little pond? So we kind of talked about some of that before, Jaime. Are there other kind of pieces of advice? Because folks in the Pivotal Network are not just writing the letters on behalf of the students, but they're often the trusted voice on,
Yeah.
what do I do next here? Like, you know, what's your best advice for me?
Again, I just think that I'm hopeful that that students are speaking to you at some level, either in person or over Zoom, about their college dreams and vision, because I think that could be very, if hopefully they're comfortable talking to you about it. I assume they are. Again, this kind of gets to the point of, you know, when I talk to kids about college, again, the thing I did on Friday was all about Georgetown, but then I pivoted to college in general, right? This kind of topic. And I hope that they are comfortable talking to educators, whether that's a teacher, that's a professor, that's someone. And I encourage them to do that. But you know, a student can thrive at University of Iowa, right? Big school, Purdue, whatever. Doesn't have to be this fancy brand name school. And so I think that most kids have what it takes. I just think that I'm very curious as to why that choice, why that path, and to see if they've reflected on it. I'm big on reflection about why you're doing, and it could be just because, you know, I don't know, I might not like it. But to the extent that they're able to have given it some thought, as opposed to, you know, another professor in my committee once said, some of these kids that we review are getting great high grades, top of the class, but she was a high school principal for many years. And she said, a lot of these kids are good at doing what they're told, but they're not actual learners. They're good at memorization. They're nice kids. They're fine, but they're not. They see what's right in front of them, and not one or two steps beyond. And I think that's most kids, right? They can still be successful, but I think that to be able to look beyond it, and if they haven't learned how to do it, maybe to show them what you mean, give them examples, right? I talked a little bit about the Georgetown core, right? We have this core curriculum and 2 courses in engaging diversity. And the way I break it down for them is I say, you know, I kind of want you to be a curious learner overall. So when I go to the museum, I'm a big museum, not here in DC, I always think two things: who's not in the room, or whose art am I not learning about? Because to me, a lot of learning is a lot about what I'm being taught and whose perspective, but who am I not learning about? And I realized this after college, because when I go to the Alamo, if you ever go to the Alamo, you hear the history, and then you look at it very differently the more you learn. And you're thinking, I learned about history of Texas from what particular perspective? I'll just say the colonizers. You would think that Native Americans were so happy to see the Spaniards. And so that's the kind of student that I think is that's what I mean by I learned this, but then you take it at face value. So I just say, who's not in the room? Who? Think about what you might be missing. Any other questions?
Folks, let me ask all of you a quick question as we, oh, I'm sorry, Caitlin, did you unmute there?
Yeah, I have a really quick question. What is the ideal length for the letter? Like, I feel like I write too much, if I'm being honest. Like, what is good for you guys? 1 page? Like, I don't know. I think I write too much.
I think 1 page is fine. Well, here's a question I have though. To me, I find it useful if you fill out that grid with, because you can build on it, right? It can save you times. Again, the letter you're writing is going to go to the same 20 colleges or 15 or whatever number of colleges, right? But that form, if you fill it out, can tell us something else. I forget what the 5 things that we ask, right? And so I think one page is more than enough. Page and a half, if you'd like. But what we're doing when we're reading that letter is we're looking for quotes or highlight. And again, the old days, highlighting the example that we're taking just quick notes. But I don't know, Heidi, what do you think?
First of all, you all write outstanding letters. That's why you're here. But I guess I would say, Caitlin, I feel like it's not, it's going to sound silly. It's really not so much about length. Like a 1-page letter that's well written is really just as effective as like a 2-page letter. Like sometimes you just have so much to say about a student, right? It spills over. But I think also part of what we're looking for is this kind of like a cohesive narrative. Like, them in a classroom, but you also know these kids to some extent, at least, pandemic, Zoom, whatever, but like, these kids outside of the classroom, right? And there's there's a coherency that you can help bring, because we're looking at all these pieces of their story, and we're looking at pieces from the school about the setting, and we're looking at pieces of boxes they've checked off. And honestly, lots of school counselors aren't all that helpful in their letters, because your school counselors are just swamped and have pretty generic things. Some of them are great, but so kind of your letter, Caitlin, to me is that like really good letters, you can just kind of see that student as they like who they are when they enter into their room, how they bring themselves into that room, kind of how they're taking what they're learning from your room, and as Jaime said, going out and trying to do other things with it. A couple of memorable specific examples that help us kind of see that arc. That's it. I think that's about a page. I think if it's much less than a page, like you can't kind of connect those dots, but we don't need 15 examples of it.
Yeah.
Right. A couple of good memorable examples, sticky examples, and we're like good to go.
Whenever I'm talking to my students, I advise them to ask teachers if they can write a strong and specific letter. And if they can't, then ask somebody else.
Yeah, I do think we see a bunch of letters, Julie, that's good advice. I think we see a bunch of letters where the kid got an A in the class, but the teacher doesn't know them very well. And those are not very helpful letters. We know the kid got an A in the class. We can see the transcript. It's like, but actually a lot of times we get letters from teachers where the kids struggled a little bit. Those can be great letters because the kids are going to struggle here. Everybody struggles here. Like, I mean, everybody struggles at some point in college. It's like the point of college, right? So like this idea that like you saw the kid work to learn, like that's huge. So yeah, I think this idea about, strong doesn't have to mean they got an A. Strong is, I can support this kid on their growth journey as a learner.
Question, Jaime, not about letters, but about the kids. If I advise my kids this, but am I right that if the college asks for supplemental questions on like the Common App, that is where they should really go in, this is the college for me, while staying on top? Like,
Yes. Again, I think the Common App and other colleges might provide candidates more opportunities to expand on the personal situations, let's say. That's the way to run with it. But a student, again, for a college where letters will be read, for documents will actually matter. I'm a big fan of telling us, even for Georgetown, I say, you can always upload an extra document, to explain circumstances or to explain situations that provide context. It seems, you hear that word a lot for a reason. We need context. It's just so important to understand how that student is seeing themselves at a particular institution, academic and socially, as fit, right? Now, again, just remember, we are seeing their essays, your letter, counselor letter, and then Georgetown also requires an interview. Now, again, that interview can sometimes that report can be very helpful. If they happen to match with a really good interviewer who writes a really good report, because sometimes I learn more from that interview report than I get from the teacher letter. This is especially true at larger public schools where the teachers don't know Georgetown or don't really, and that's fair, right? But I'm hoping that alumni interviewer has been to Georgetown, especially if they're recent, and they're able to draw out that kid. Then I get a better sense of who that student is. The only other thing I'll add is kids always look stronger on paper than in person. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but they're just there's resume and this list of activities, and but then when you see them, I just saw them again, you're like, oh yeah, you're 16, 17, you're kind of awkward. and that's fine. Although some kids are not. I mean, again, 3 of the 4 kids I interviewed today, I was just like, oh my God, Georgetown would be lucky to have you. If you're at all like what you come across in those 20 minutes, just never struggled. And I was like, wow, especially coming out of COVID, I was impressed. I never underestimate the ability to connect with strangers. Maybe I overvalue it. I don't know. But again, I'm always thinking they're going to be in a space with a lot of people they've never met before. And that ability to connect, I think, can be helpful.
It can be, though, but I'll say as a science professor, we see plenty of introverts, and it all works for us too. I was actually recently on a panel for there's a whole new group coming out around mastery transcript work, which is kind of fascinating and interesting, and we can talk about that at a separate point in time. But one of the things I was fascinated by was an admissions officer from the University of Michigan was on the call, and on the Zoom thing, and they were asking kind of impactful parts of applications. And like University of Michigan is at scale, right? Like these are, and he's like, student essay and teacher letter. I was like, dang. Like note to self, teacher letter at Michigan too. But I also just say that to be reassuring, because I think sometimes the perception is that it must only be the small places that are actually, reading, and the rest of them, it's all through some like giant sorting bin. I don't think they have as many eyes on it for as long, like for all the stuff, but they've got eyes on the stuff you're writing too. And so I also just, in like death throes of the November 1st deadline, real people are reading the letters you're writing, and we're all about trying to admit learners. So also, Iris, I'll say, like, kids will struggle. And if all you can do is talk about struggles and not like growth from it, that's going to be hard, right? At a bunch of schools. But helping us see the kid, including how they grew, like, that's good. And everybody's looking for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you guys. I mean, I think the 17-year-old, 18-year-old junction, like the half-baked version of kids, is like absolutely delightful, right? So we know what that, honestly, I mean, I don't know, we don't see it in this cohort, but in other groups I've read with, like, when it's a 17-year-old being an authentic 17-year-old, and when a teacher's writing about an authentic 17-year-old, because they're all kind of half-baked still.
Mm-hmm.
Looks too weird and polished. We're pretty sure it wasn't a 17-year-old doing that writing.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be reassuring too. Folks, I want to honor everybody's time, especially Jaime's, because I know he's got all the stuff you're writing, he's reading.
Well, first I gotta do my expense reports.
Oh.
I got this today.
If you follow his Instagram account, he's been having a good time down in Texas.
Hey, listen, you have two choices, and you may as well make the best of it, right?
But thanks to all of you, and we'll be putting the whole video up. We created in previous years this file of kind of redacted student application paperwork, and we're going to put that up again as a read-only document with a few notes attached to it, so folks can see that. And Seth will do his brilliant editing thing and craft this also down into some punchy takeaways, and we'll go from there. But folks, thanks so much for joining. Good luck this week. Good luck with the letters. It's fabulous having everybody here.
Yes.
Jaime, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everyone. Is it Wednesday yet? That's tomorrow. Tomorrow's Wednesday, right?
It's only Tuesday.
So,
I have 2 letters due tomorrow, so don't make it Wednesday yet.
all right. Well, great to see everyone, and always happy to provide assistance wherever possible. Good luck with all your letters. Thanks for all the work you put into them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, folks.